The first Persian Gulf War. So you guys should left off, I believe, with Iran-Iraq War. Uh, Ended in 1988. So we're talking just a couple years later, 1990. The first Persian Gulf War. So we had established that, I think I established that Saddam Hussein had taken power in 1979, and he's well established now as a dictator by this time. And based off his 8-year war with the Iranians, he had amassed the fourth largest military or army in the world. And he had this group of elite fighters called the Republican Guard that were battle tested. And Saddam was a major threat in the region. And this would be an attempt, so he goes to war with Iran, and now he's going to pick on another neighbor, border neighbor, Kuwait. So part of the reason that he's going to invade Kuwait is he claims that there's manipulation of the oil prices, that Kuwaitis are slant drilling some of the oil from an Iraqi oil field. Ultimately, the real reason is he needs to pay off some debt from the Iran-Iraq war. And based on the U.S. support during the Iran-Iraq war, he doesn't feel that the United States will necessarily care if he ventures into another neighbor's territory. However, by this time, we have a president that was elected in '88, George H.W. Bush, the senior George Bush. And he's coming up on re-election. So re-election would be 92. And he is a staunch supporter. Now, remember, the Bush family comes from oil, Texas oil. So he's very familiar with the choreography of the oil industry, and is well aware that Kuwait is one of the largest oil producers in the world, and Iraq is also a large oil producer. And in his mind, Saddam is making a power play, economic power play. Just so happens that Kuwait is one of our allies in the region. And rather than support Iraq like we had in Iran, George H.W. Bush takes the side of the Kuwaitis. And he immediately lays the groundwork for there's going to be a United Nations resolution that's going to take place, which they are going to condemn the act of Saddam of invading Kuwait. And the United States is going to kind of take the lead, and George H.W. Bush will take the lead in coordinating a coalition of forces, including Middle Eastern countries that have never been our ally before, like Syria, Saudi Arabia, the coalition of a willing, I believe he called it, that are willing to fight on our side to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And after some tense talks with Saddam, Bush lets him know that we will not tolerate this action. So then it comes to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, again, a major player, the major oil producer in the world, major economic ally of the United States, is nervous that they're next on the hit list for Saddam. And so they will take action or make contact with George H.W. Bush and allow us to stage our equipment, our military in Saudi Arabia, as it's going to be a lengthy process, a matter of months building up personnel, armies, and equipment, staging it in Saudi Arabia, pointed at Iraq. So the buildup to desert or to the first Persian Gulf War, the United States will end up calling it Desert Storm, but the buildup is called Desert Shield. And during Desert Shield, that is the buildup phase with Saudi Arabia allowing the United States to stage our military in their country with the other coalition forces as we coordinate, line them up, and prepare to repel the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Saudi Arabia borders Kuwait, and that's where they were staging. At this time, I was an Army reservist working I was a medical laboratory technician, and I was put on alert for January of 1991. I was put on alert prior to January, but we were going to be sent to Germany in 1991 in support of this effort. My brother, who was a U.S. Marine at the time, was staged in Saudi Arabia. The Marines, they were there. He was an engineer offloading equipment and staging it in the desert. Now, there's a bullet here. Eventually, our military and our coalition forces are basically in an overwhelm of the Iraqi forces, even though they were battle tested, even though they were the fourth largest military in the world. Remember, they're controlled by a dictator. And once the U.S. and coalition forces got by the Republican Guard, the elite military of the Iraqis, which were devastated by the air war, the air campaign, that's going to be a 2-week process prior to the ground war. And we use new technologies. We have smart bombs, M1 Abrams tanks, which can move up to 55 miles an hour. This is a military and a technology that had never been seen, never been fielded, and this was our trial. We had smart bombs that they could laser guide through windows, so it was really a demonstration of America's military technology, and it was effective. And they had the Iraqis in complete retreat within days. Now, the Al Qaeda aspect to this, remember, Al Qaeda was starting to form in 1988 in Afghanistan. I'll get to kind of the timeline of bin Laden. But in this scenario, the United States generals, Schwarzkopf, Norman Schwarzkopf, and Colin Powell, push into Iraq, just to the outskirts of Baghdad. Now, remember, George H.W. Bush's primary goal was to liberate Kuwait. And this is the initial negative encounter that we have with Saddam. And they get to the outskirts of Baghdad, and Powell or Schwarzkopf, more than likely Schwarzkopf, lets it be known that they're in position to overthrow or topple the Saddam regime, that they could take care of it. Just give them the word. And H.W. Bush says, no, retreat or start to pull back your forces. Our purpose there was to liberate Kuwait, and that's what we were going to do, and that's what we've done, because they had the Iraqi military in shambles, and they start pulling back. In the process, one of the biggest problems that occurred during this ground war, the Desert Storm campaign, was there were so many Iraqi military members that surrendered by the tens of thousands. When they saw the American or coalition forces approaching, they just started waving white flags and we had more logistical problems trying to deal with this large amount of surrenders than anything else late in the campaign. Once the Republican Guard folded, then it was just every man for himself. And most of those conscripts, most of those soldiers were forced into the Iraqi military, and therefore they had no allegiance to Saddam. They just threw up their arms. All right, so it was a devastating defeat for Saddam Hussein. It was a monstrous demonstration of our American technology at the time. And it's going to be a short campaign. Now, I originally, when I was sent to Germany, I was working in a 500-bed military hospital, and for the ground war, the estimate was that there were going to be 30,000 U.S. and coalition casualties, and so they were basically, that first week of the ground war was going to overwhelm our medical facilities. And now there are, dozens of military facilities in the region, but we were geared up for the more severe trauma that was going to come out of the campaign. So we were on 24-hour duty. We would work 12-hour shifts, 4 on, 3 off, just getting ready for the ground campaign. Now you can see some of these pictures here. This is, one of the smart bombs from the aerial view. And this was called the Highway of Death. And the Highway of Death was created because of the retreat of the Iraqis. The Iraqis were actually in Kuwait City, the capital city of Kuwait. And once the Americans and the coalition forces started to pick them off with these smart bombs, our technology, they grabbed whatever vehicle they could and started flying back to Iraq, driving back to Iraq. And there's only one main highway that goes all the way through Iraq. But it's called Highway 1, or we used to call it Military Supply Route Tampa, or MSR Tampa. And they got over this ridge line on the outskirts of Kuwait City, and the U.S. military Air Force just devastated these vehicles. And for miles, about a 2 to 3 mile stretch, were scenes like you see here. Literally thousands of vehicles and thousands of dead Iraqis. Now, my brother was part of the cleanup project at the end of Desert Storm, where he had to drive through and clean up some of the Highway of Death. And he said that he will never forget the stench or the smell or the sights that he saw during that devastation. Oh, you can also see, and I forgot this part in the notes, the oil fields. Now, Kuwait, again, is a large oil producer. Saddam knows that. Saddam knows that the Americans, one of their main interests there, especially H.W. Bush, is oil. So in their retreat, I forget how many hundreds of oil wells were set on fire by the retreating Iraqis. If you've ever seen the movie Jarhead, Jarhead's kind of based off of this conflict, and they do a pretty good job of showing the results. My brother said it was like nighttime during the day because the number of oil wells and the black smoke. It was like an eclipse would take place for weeks, months even, because they had to try to extinguish those flames. And he said that it was basically raining oil, and you would always have this oily silt on your uniform and on your skin. Now, the United States will send in a team out of Houston, or out of Texas. Red Adair, I believe was his name, and his civilian group would go in and cap all of the burning oil wells. So the United States used, or I should say the Iraqis, Saddam, used kind of an environmental warfare, so to speak. Okay, so how does this tie into Osama bin Laden? And I told you at the beginning, the Soviet Union withdraws from Afghanistan in '89. The Mujahideen fighters, of which bin Laden was one of, disperses. Bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia, a hero to the jihadists anyway, but not necessarily to his government. So his government, he takes up some opposition to the monarchy, and he'll be exiled. So you see, in 1991, during Desert Storm, bin Laden is exiled, and that means he's just kicked out of the country, and he goes to Sudan, and kind of disappears for a while. But what he is doing, of course, is coordinating and solidifying Al Qaeda at that time. And based off of the fact that the Saudi Arabian government, his former home, allowed the United States into the most sacred country, Muslim country in the world. It's got the two holiest sites in Islam, which would be Mecca and Medina. Medina is the burial place of Muhammad. He, at this point, really solidifies his anti-Western ideas, and they start to plan. Now, many of you may or may not know that the World Trade Center, when it was destroyed during 9/11, was also attacked in 1993. And in 1993, they tried to drive, or they did drive, a van full of explosives into the garage, one of the underground garages in one of the trade centers, one of the buildings, Twin Towers, and tried to tip it over. It exploded it. 6 people were killed, but they basically were trying to tip over one of the Twin Towers. Now, that wasn't bin Laden or Al Qaeda, but that was some of the future members or planners of the Mujahideen that coordinated that effort. Bin Laden, on the other hand, will leave Sudan in 1996. He's going to go back to Afghanistan. And while he's in Afghanistan, he meets a guy by the name of Mullah Muhammad Omar, and he's the founder of the Taliban. Now, the Taliban is an extreme Islamic fundamentalist organization trying to become a legitimate government of Afghanistan. They've taken control of Afghanistan, and they are implementing severe Sharia law. Women are going to disappear basically beneath burqas, they're called, or full. They cover their face, you can't see their eyes, cover their legs. The only thing you can see basically is their slippers. And that's going to be implemented throughout Afghanistan. And bin Laden is on board with that type of Islamic fundamentalism. So the Taliban allows bin Laden and other extreme organizations to use Afghanistan as a training base for anti-Western militias, basically. All right, and over time, over 120 terror training camps are going to exist throughout Afghanistan. Which brings us to a timeline for 9/11, and I think I'll stop it here and build 9/11 to the present for tomorrow. Keep this short, relatively short.